useless woman. Leave my home. You don't have a place here anymore.
What have I done to deserve this, honey?
Michael Thompson didn't just end his marriage. He destroyed it publicly, carefully, and without mercy. The morning Grace Thompson's life collapsed began quietly, too quietly, for the kind of humiliation that was about to unfold. At dawn, under the soft Lego sun, strangers in dark security uniforms dragged her suitcase to the iron gates of the Thompson estate in Ikoyi. One by one, her belongings were thrown onto the spotless driveway, clothes, shoes, framed photos, landing in the dust like they had no history, no meaning, no owner worth respecting.
Night boys gathered fast.
Some pretended to jog. Others walked dogs they never usually walked. Phones were already out, recording, posting, sending clips into WhatsApp groups and Instagram stories before Grace could even process what was happening. This wasn't just a breakup. This was a spectacle. Grace stood there silently, clutching a worn envelope against her chest, her face calm, but her body stiff with shock. Inside the mansion, Michael stood in the marble foyer with his arms crossed, watching her the way you watch a stranger being removed from a place they don't belong.
No επαλλαγή. No hesitation.
Just finality. Behind him stood his mother, Patricia, smiling the way women smile when they believe they've finally won. And above them, on the second-floor balcony, wearing Grace's imported silk wrapper and cradling her pregnant belly like a trophy, stood Jennifer, the woman Michael had been sleeping with for nearly a year. Patricia's voice cut through the humid air, loud enough for every neighbor to hear. You never deserved this life. You were always just a charity case. Then Michael did the unthinkable. He walked down the steps, pulled cash from his wallet, and held it out to Grace like she was nothing. Take it, he said coldly, and disappear. That was when Patricia slapped Grace, hard. What none of them knew. They were throwing the true owner of that mansion out of her own $700 million inheritance. If you've ever been humiliated, underestimated, or betrayed by the people who should have protected you, this story is for you. Watch until the very end, because the truth doesn't rush, but when it arrives, it changes everything. And before you continue, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss stories where silence becomes power and justice arrives right on time. Grace stood at the iron gates of the Thompson estate as the morning sun crept slowly over Ikoyi, warm light spilling across a scene that felt anything but warm. The air was quiet in the way it gets just before something irreversible happens. Palm trees swayed gently. Birds moved between branches. And yet, Grace felt like she was standing on a stage with invisible spotlights trained on her every breath. The gates were open wide, exposing the long, immaculate driveway she had once walked proudly as Michael's wife. Now it felt like a corridor of judgment. Two security guards she did not recognize dragged her suitcase across the tiled ground. The wheels scraped loudly, deliberately, as if the sound itself was meant to announce her disgrace. One of them unzipped it without care. Her clothes spilled out, neatly folded dresses, blouses she had ironed herself, shoes she had saved months to buy. A framed wedding photo slid out last, the glass cracking as it hit the driveway. Grace flinched, just slightly. Not enough for anyone to call it weakness. Another bag followed. Then another. Her books. Her scarves. A small box of personal letters. Everything that had once fit quietly into her life was now scattered in public view like evidence of a crime she didn't understand she'd committed. Across the street, curtains shifted. Doors opened. Neighbors stepped out pretending they had errands, pretending this was coincidence. A woman paused with her dog, phone already lifted. A man leaned against his car, recording without shame. Someone whispered. Someone laughed nervously. Phones tilted, zoomed, steadied. This moment would be shared long before breakfast was over. Grace became aware of how still she was standing. Her fingers were locked tightly around a worn envelope she had carried out with her. An old, weathered thing she had kept close without knowing why. Her knuckles were white, but her face remained composed. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, but she forced her shoulders back, her chin lifted. She would not give them tears. Not here. From the doorway of the mansion, Michael watched. He stood in the marble foyer, wearing an expensive agbada, freshly pressed, every fold perfect. His arms were crossed, his posture relaxed, as if this were a business transaction instead of the collapse of a marriage. There was no anger on his face.
No guilt.
Just distance. The kind of distance that says a decision has already been made and reconsideration is no longer necessary. Grace searched his face instinctively, foolishly, for something familiar. A flicker of regret. A trace of the man who once held her hand and promised before God to protect her. She found nothing. His eyes passed over her like she was a stranger who had overstayed her welcome. Behind him stood Patricia. Michael's mother leaned slightly forward, clearly enjoying the view. Her lips were curved in a tight, satisfied smile, the kind that comes from long-awaited victory. From the very first day of Grace's marriage, Patricia had made her disdain clear. Small comments, public corrections, subtle humiliations wrapped in politeness. Now, she no longer bothered with subtlety. She stepped closer to the edge of the entrance, so her voice would carry. "I told you from the beginning," Patricia said loudly, glancing around as if addressing the neighborhood itself. This one never belonged here. A girl from a small village, trying to wear a life that wasn't made for her. Grace felt the words land like stones, heavy and sharp, but she kept her gaze forward. Patricia continued, emboldened by the audience. "This family has standards.
History. Class.
We made a mistake letting charity into this house, and now the mistake has been corrected." A murmur rippled through the watchers. Phones lifted higher. From above, a laugh floated down. Grace looked up slowly, already knowing what she would see, already bracing herself. Jennifer stood on the second-floor balcony, one hand resting possessively on her pregnant belly, the other holding the railing like it was already hers. She wore Grace's imported silk wrapper, the one Grace had bought on a trip Michael never attended. The fabric hugged her body confidently, deliberately. Her hair was styled, her makeup flawless. She smiled the way women smile when they believe they have replaced someone entirely. "Well," Jennifer called down, amusement dripping from her voice, "I hope you packed everything important. Wouldn't want you coming back for anything later." She laughed again, rubbing her belly slowly, theatrically, as if to remind everyone watching what she represented now. The future.
The heir.
The woman who stayed. Grace's jaw tightened. She felt something hot rise in her chest. Anger, humiliation, disbelief. But she pressed it down hard. Crying would make this easier for them. Begging would make it sweeter. She refused to give them either. Michael finally moved. He walked down the steps unhurriedly, adjusting his sleeves as if preparing for a meeting. When he reached Grace, he didn't look at the mess of her life scattered behind her. He didn't look at her face. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and counted crisp bills carefully.
1, 2,
3,
4.
He held the money out to her, arm extended, like he was offering alms. "Take this," he said, his voice flat. "It's more than you came with. Use it to start over somewhere else." Grace stared at the money for a long second. It wasn't the amount that hurt. It was the meaning. For years reduced to charity. Love reduced to loose change. Her entire existence in his life summed up in bills he could replace without thinking. From the balcony, Jennifer laughed sharply. "You better take it fast," she shouted. "Once this baby comes, there won't be anything left for you." Patricia stepped closer, her eyes cold now, sharp with long-suppressed contempt. "You wasted my son's time," she snapped. 4 years and nothing to show for it. No child. No value. Just embarrassment. Before Grace could react, Patricia raised her hand. The slap landed hard. The sound echoed off the compound walls, loud enough to make several neighbors gasp. Phones shook as people adjusted their grip, desperate not to miss a second. Grace's head turned slightly from the impact. For a brief, terrifying moment, her vision blurred. Then she straightened. She did not scream. She did not raise her hand. She did not collapse. She lifted her head slowly, her cheek burning, her eyes steady. The security guards moved in immediately, grabbing her arms as if she were dangerous, as if she might contaminate the property if left unchecked. Their grip was firm, impersonal. Procedure. As they guided her through the gates, Grace caught one last glimpse of the mansion. The home she had cleaned, prayed in, loved in. The place where she had shrunk herself trying to fit into a family that had already decided she never belonged. Behind her, she heard Jennifer already talking excitedly on the phone, discussing paint colors, furniture, and nursery ideas. Patricia's voice joined in, sharp and triumphant. Michael said nothing at all. The gates closed with a heavy metallic clang. Grace stood outside, alone with her scattered belongings, the morning sun now fully risen. Phones were still pointed at her. The world waited for her to break. She bent slowly, picked up her cracked wedding photo, and placed it carefully into her suitcase. She still did not cry, because what none of them knew, what they were far too busy celebrating to notice, was that this humiliation was not the end of Grace's story. It was only the moment truth decided to be patient. That night, after the house went quiet and Michael fell asleep beside her like nothing in the world was wrong, Grace lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of a man who no longer belonged to her. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It had settled into her bones, heavy and undeniable, leaving no space for hope or excuses. She felt hollow, as if something essential had finally cracked open. She slipped out of bed without waking him and moved to the small prayer room she had carved out for herself at the far end of the house. It was the only place in that mansion where she still felt like herself. Kneeling on the mat, she reached into her handbag and pulled out the envelope she had carried for years without opening. It was old and worn, the edges softened by time and handling. Her grandmother's handwriting was still visible on the front, careful and deliberate. Grace's throat tightened as memories surfaced, her grandmother sitting in the shade of a mango tree in Enugu, pressing the envelope into her palm with surprising firmness. "Don't open it yet," her grandmother had said then, eyes steady, voice calm. "Not when life is easy. Not when you're in love. Open it only when your heart is ready to hear the truth." Grace hadn't understood. She'd been young, hopeful, more focused on the future than on hidden pasts. She'd kept the envelope sealed through her wedding, through Patricia's insults, through years of shrinking herself to fit a life that never truly welcomed her. She carried it quietly from house to house, drawer to drawer, like a promise she wasn't brave enough to claim. Now, kneeling alone in the quiet, her hands trembling, Grace knew the moment had come. She broke the seal slowly. Inside was a neatly folded letter and a thick document bound with an official stamp. Grace unfolded the letter first, her grandmother's familiar handwriting flowing across the page like a voice from another lifetime. "My dear Grace," it began, "if you are reading this, then life has shown you what love can cost and what silence can protect." Grace swallowed hard and kept reading. Elizabeth Thompson wrote of a life no one had ever told Grace about. Of being born into the Thompson family as the first daughter, groomed from childhood to inherit land, properties, and influence. Of living in Lagos in the 1960s, surrounded by wealth and expectations, until she fell in love with a schoolteacher from Enugu who had nothing to offer but honesty and peace. "They told me to choose," the letter said, "the fortune or the man. I chose love." Elizabeth wrote about walking away from the family, refusing to sign formal renunciation papers, believing dignity mattered more than money. She wrote about returning to the village, living modestly, raising children far from the noise of Lagos elite, never once regretting her decision. What she never knew, what no one bothered to correct, was that her name had remained on the family trust. Grace's breath caught as she turned to the document beneath the letter. It was a certified property deed, the Thompson estate. Multiple properties listed across Lagos, Abuja, and Port Harcourt.
Dates.
Registration numbers. Seals. This wasn't a story. It was law. Elizabeth Thompson had died without a will, without formally removing herself from the inheritance, and with Grace as her only living descendant. Grace sat back on her heels, her mind racing, heart pounding so loudly she feared it would wake the house. The woman Patricia had mocked as a poor village relic, the woman Michael had barely tolerated at family gatherings, had been the original heiress to everything they now flaunted. Everything. Grace didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat on the floor until dawn, reading the letter again and again, absorbing the final lines that felt written for this exact moment. Real power, my granddaughter, does not shout. It does not beg. It waits. And when truth is ready, it speaks for itself. 3 days later, Grace found herself sitting in a quiet law office, hands folded tightly in her lap, as a probate lawyer named Rebecca Williams reviewed the documents with intense focus. Rebecca asked careful questions, requested additional records, and made phone calls that stretched into hours. 2 weeks later, Rebecca called Grace back. "Everything checks out," she said calmly. "Your grandmother's name was never removed from the trust. With no competing heirs and no legal renunciation, the estate defaults to you. But we do this properly, quietly, thoroughly." For the next 3 months, Grace lived 2 lives. Outwardly, she remained the obedient wife. Polite at family dinners, silent during insults, invisible when Jennifer appeared. Inwardly, she was preparing. Rebecca traced bloodlines, filed motions, notified trustees, and secured court approvals. Every document was verified. Every loophole sealed. Grace watched Michael change during those months. She watched him stop pretending. Watched Jennifer grow bold. Watched Patricia's cruelty sharpen. She endured it all without a word, not out of weakness, but because she understood something they didn't. The house they were fighting to control was already hers. The life they were stripping away from her had never truly belonged to them. And when the day came that they would throw her out like trash, Grace would already be standing on the firmest ground she had ever known: truth. She folded her grandmother's letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope. Then she waited. Grace had entered the Thompson family believing love was enough. She believed that kindness could soften sharp edges, that humility could win hearts, that patience would eventually be recognized as strength. On her wedding day, as she stood beside Michael in ivory lace, she told herself that marrying into wealth didn't mean losing herself. It just meant learning a new way of living. Patricia disabused her of that belief almost immediately. It started with small corrections, delivered with a smile sharp enough to cut. Patricia adjusted Grace's pronunciation during introductions, laughing lightly as if it were helpful. She commented on how Grace held cutlery, how she greeted elders, how she dressed. "We do things differently here," she would say, always emphasizing the word here, as though Grace's entire existence before marriage had been a rehearsal that didn't quite count. At family gatherings, Patricia made sure Grace's village roots were never forgotten. She would ask questions that sounded innocent but weren't. "Is this how they cook in Enugu? Or you people are very strong, growing up with so little?" Each remark was followed by polite laughter from relatives who understood the unspoken rule. This was entertainment, and Grace was the lesson. Michael noticed, at least at first. In public, he played the role of mediator, smiling nervously, telling his mother to ease up, squeezing Grace's hand under the table as if that compensated for the humiliation she was swallowing whole. In private, he urged Grace to be patient. "She'll come around," he said more than once. "Just don't take it personally." So Grace tried harder. She learned new recipes to please Patricia's palate, hosting dinners that took hours to prepare. She rearranged the house before every family visit, making sure everything looked perfect. She dressed more conservatively, softened her accent, watched her posture, her laughter, her opinions. She told herself this was what compromise looked like. That love sometimes meant bending until you fit. But patience, Grace discovered, does not earn respect in a house that feeds on control. As the months passed, Michael's defense of her grew quieter. His hand squeezes became absent. His reassurances turned vague. He stopped correcting his mother altogether. Instead, he would look away when Patricia spoke, as if ignoring cruelty was easier than confronting it. Slowly, subtly, he began to echo her tone. The shift was so gradual Grace barely noticed it at first. Then the question started. "When will you give us a child?" Patricia asked one afternoon, her voice sharp and public. "A Thompson man needs heirs." Grace laughed awkwardly, brushed it off, told herself it was normal pressure. But the comments didn't stop. They multiplied. Each visit brought fresh reminders, thinly veiled prayers, not-so-subtle suggestions of herbal remedies, doctors, fasting. Michael changed too. He began to come home later, stay out longer, and sigh heavily whenever the topic came up. He started speaking about children like a personal disappointment instead of a shared journey. When Grace cried quietly one night, he told her she was being too sensitive. "My mother just wants what's best for the family," he said. What started as concern turned into accusation. Patricia's words sharpened with time. "Some women are just not built for motherhood," she said once, shaking her head. Another time, she whispered loudly enough for Grace to hear, "A wife who can't produce is just occupying space." Grace smiled through it all. She attended church services where prayers for her womb felt more like public trials. She endured family meetings where her body became a topic of discussion, her worth measured in months and cycles. She learned how to nod without responding, how to swallow humiliation with grace, how to excuse herself to the bathroom just to breathe. Michael stopped touching her the way he used to. He stopped asking how she was coping. He stopped saying we when they talked about the future. Slowly, imperceptibly, Grace realized she was no longer his partner. She was a problem he didn't know how to fix.
Still, she stayed.
She believed loyalty mattered. She believed marriage was endurance. She believed if she just held on long enough, something would change. What Grace didn't realize then was that the marriage she was fighting to preserve had been built on a lie long before Jennifer ever entered the picture. A lie that called cruelty class, silence respect, and suffering character. And the longer Grace stayed quiet, the easier it became for everyone else to forget she was human at all. Grace did not learn about the affair the way women in movies do, with dramatic confessions or frantic explanations. No one sat her down. No one begged for forgiveness. The truth crept into her life quietly, disguised as carelessness, until it became impossible to ignore. It began with small, unsettling details. A phone left face up on the kitchen counter while Michael showered, lighting up with a name Grace didn't recognize. Late-night calls he stepped outside to take, his voice lowered, his back turned. Shirts that came back from the dry cleaners carrying a perfume that was sweet and unfamiliar, clinging to the fabric long after he insisted it was nothing. Grace noticed everything, filed it away carefully, and told herself she was imagining things. Marriage, she believed, required trust. Doubt felt like betrayal. Then Jennifer appeared. Michael introduced her at a family dinner as a business associate, someone he'd been working with closely. Jennifer was always overdressed for the occasion, her heels too high, her makeup too deliberate, her laughter too loud. She sat closer to Michael than necessary, touched his arm when she spoke, leaned in when she laughed. Her eyes flicked to Grace often, studying her with a knowing smile that never quite reached warmth. Patricia noticed too, and instead of questioning it, she encouraged it. "She carries herself well," Patricia remarked once, glancing pointedly at Jennifer. "Some women understand how to keep a man interested." The words were delivered casually, but their meaning was sharp. Grace smiled politely, pretending not to feel the ground shift beneath her feet. Jennifer became a regular presence, at dinners, at church events, at family gatherings. No one seemed surprised. No one questioned why a business associate was always around. Grace watched as Jennifer moved through the Thompson family like she belonged there, laughing with Patricia, receiving approving looks from relatives who had never bothered to learn Grace's middle name. The messages eventually became undeniable. One evening, Grace reached for the phone Michael had left on the counter and saw a conversation open, Pet names, inside jokes, promises wrapped in casual words. There was no confusion, no room for interpretation. Grace's hands trembled as she set the phone back down, her chest tightening as if the air had suddenly vanished. She did not confront him. She went to bed early, stared into the darkness, and let the truth settle where hope used to live. The final blow came at an Awambi party months later. The music was loud, the hall crowded, laughter spilling from every corner. Grace stood beside Michael, already exhausted, when Patricia tapped her glass for attention. Jennifer stepped forward in a fitted dress, smiling radiantly, one hand resting deliberately on her stomach. "I have wonderful news," Jennifer announced, her voice bright, confident.
I'm pregnant.
The room erupted. Applause.
Gasps.
Congratulations. Patricia rushed forward, tears in her eyes, praising God loudly. Relatives crowded Jennifer, touching her belly, blessing her future. Someone hugged Michael. Grace watched her husband's face change. He smiled, openly, freely, with a joy she had not seen in years. It lit him up from the inside, unrestrained and proud. In that moment, Grace understood something with terrifying clarity. This was not a mistake. This was not an accident. This was a replacement. No one looked at Grace. No one noticed the way her hands clenched, the way her breathing slowed, the way something inside her quietly shut down. She stood there smiling, applauding softly, as her marriage ended without a single word being spoken. That night, Grace went home and said nothing, because by then, she had learned the truth does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it reveals itself in who is celebrated and who is erased. Grace did not raise her voice. She did not threaten. She did not confront Michael or challenge Patricia or warn Jennifer to watch her step. That kind of noise, she knew now, only fed people who thrived on power and spectacle. Instead, Grace chose something far more dangerous. She chose silence with intention. 2 days after she opened her grandmother's envelope, Grace sat in the reception area of a quiet law office on Victoria Island, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her heart racing beneath her calm exterior. The name on the frosted glass door read Rebecca Williams, Probate and Trust Law. Grace had chosen the firm carefully, not because it was flashy, but because its reputation was exacting. The kind of place where nothing slipped through cracks. Rebecca Williams was younger than Grace expected. Sharp-eyed, composed. The kind of woman who listened more than she spoke. She reviewed the deed slowly, asked precise questions, and read Elizabeth Thompson's letter twice without interruption. When she finally looked up, her expression did not soften. It sharpened. "This is significant," Rebecca said quietly. "But significance means nothing without verification. If we do this, we do it cleanly. Completely." Grace nodded. "I don't want noise," she said. "I want truth." For the next 3 months, Grace lived between two realities. In one, she returned home each night to a marriage that was visibly unraveling. Michael barely spoke to her anymore. When he did, it was with impatience disguised as exhaustion. He stopped pretending to include her in decisions. He no longer asked where she was going or when she'd be back. Sometimes he didn't come home at all. Jennifer's presence grew bolder. She stopped being introduced as a business associate and became simply Jennifer. She called Michael freely, even when Grace was sitting beside him. She showed up unannounced at family gatherings. Patricia praised her openly now, comparing her confidence to Grace's quiet nature in ways that weren't compliments at all. "Some women are just more suitable," Patricia said once, smiling thinly. Grace smiled back. Inside, she felt herself becoming transparent, as if she were slowly fading out of a life she once believed was permanent. She moved through the house like a shadow, present but unseen. She cooked. She cleaned. She attended church. She answered questions politely. She absorbed cruelty without reaction. And then she left quietly. 2 or 3 times a week, Grace told Michael she had errands. He didn't ask questions. He rarely noticed. She took taxis across the city to Rebecca's office, where the real work was happening. Rebecca traced bloodlines with forensic precision, pulling records that stretched back decades. She confirmed Elizabeth Thompson's birthright as firstborn daughter to the original Thompson patriarch. She uncovered trust documents that had never been properly amended, legal oversights buried under years of assumptions and arrogance. Each discovery added weight. Rebecca cross-checked property registries, verified titles, confirmed valuations. She involved 2 additional law firms, not because she needed them, but because redundancy was protection. Every document was reviewed. Every loophole closed. Court filings were made quietly. Notices were sent discreetly to trustees who had long forgotten Elizabeth Thompson's name. Grace listened, asked questions, took notes. She did not smile. At night, she returned to the house where Jennifer's laughter echoed louder, where Patricia's contempt had sharpened into confidence. She watched Michael retreat further into himself, his guilt dissolving into justification. She watched him stop trying to hide the affair, as though Grace's silence had been mistaken for permission. Once, Patricia cornered her in the living room after church. "You've been very quiet lately," she said, her eyes calculating. Almost defeated. Grace met her gaze calmly. "I've learned that not every battle needs an audience." Patricia scoffed. "Careful. Silence can be mistaken for weakness." Grace nodded politely. "Only by people who don't understand it." That night, Grace wrote her grandmother's words on a small piece of paper and kept it in her wallet. Real power doesn't announce itself. It waits. The pressure intensified as weeks passed. Jennifer's pregnancy became a spectacle. Patricia hosted prayer meetings, Thanksgiving dinners, and impromptu celebrations. Michael glowed with attention, basking in praise for becoming a father. Grace attended every event, smiling softly, offering congratulations, enduring sideways glances, and whispered judgments. No one suspected anything. That was the point. Behind the scenes, Rebecca secured final probate approval. The trust documents were executed. Ownership transferred. The Thompson estate, Ikoyi Mansion included, was legally Grace's. Quietly.
Completely.
The day Rebecca called to confirm everything was finalized, Grace sat in her car for a long time without turning the engine on. She felt no rush of triumph. No urge to scream or cry. Just a deep, steady calm she hadn't felt in years. "You're protected now," Rebecca said. "Legally. Financially. Completely." Grace thanked her and hung up. Then she went home. The house felt different that night. Smaller. Temporary. As if it already knew it no longer belonged to the people claiming it. Grace moved through the rooms slowly, touching nothing, observing everything. The walls Patricia planned to repaint. The master bedroom Jennifer already imagined as hers. The prayer room Grace would soon lose. She packed nothing. She waited. When Michael finally threw her out weeks later, when the slap landed, the gates closed, the world laughed and recorded, Grace did not crumble. Because the war had already been won in silence. All that remained was for truth to choose its moment to speak. Grace checked into the hotel in Lekki just before noon, using her maiden name and paying in cash. It was not a place meant for escape or luxury. The room was small, clean, forgettable, cream walls, a narrow bed, a desk by the window. Exactly what she needed. Somewhere no one would think to look. Somewhere she could breathe. She placed her suitcase on the floor and set her grandmother's envelope on the bedside table with care. Then she sat down and did nothing for a long time. Outside, traffic moved as usual. Life continued without her. Inside, Grace allowed the weight of the morning to settle, not as despair, but as confirmation. The gates had closed behind her. The spectacle had been made complete. And now, silence would do the rest. She turned off her phone. Calls came immediately. Numbers she recognized and numbers she didn't. Messages followed. Some curious, some sympathetic, some already asking for gossip. Grace didn't read them. She let the screen go dark and placed the phone in the drawer, as if sealing away a former version of herself. In the days that followed, she stayed offline entirely. No posts.
No explanations.
No defense. To the outside world, she vanished. And in that absence, people filled the space with their own conclusions. They assumed defeat.
Shame.
Weakness. Inside the Thompson estate, the noise was deafening. Jennifer moved into the master suite that same afternoon, rolling her suitcases across marble floors that had once echoed with Grace's quiet footsteps. She filmed the room from every angle, smiling at her reflection in the mirror, adjusting curtains she had no right to touch. She posted clips online with soft music and captions that framed the takeover as destiny. New beginnings. Blessed. Stepping into my season. The comments poured in, congratulations, heart emojis, prayers for her pregnancy. Jennifer responded to everyone, basking in attention, moving through the house as though ownership came with occupancy. Patricia took charge immediately. She called in interior designers whose fees alone could have paid for entire houses elsewhere. She walked them through the mansion with brisk authority, pointing out what she wanted removed. Grace's curtains were deemed too simple. Her furniture, uninspired. Family photos quietly disappeared into storage. Patricia instructed workers to repaint walls, replace rugs, rearrange spaces until nothing of Grace remained. This house needs a fresh start, Patricia declared. A proper one. When the designers reached the small prayer room Grace had used, Patricia didn't hesitate. Turn this into a nursery, she said. We won't be needing this anymore. Michael watched it all with satisfaction. He hosted friends in the evenings, pouring drinks, laughing loudly, telling stories that framed his decision as liberation. He spoke about moving on and choosing happiness, like a man who believed the universe had finally rewarded him. When asked about Grace, he shrugged. Some people just aren't built for this life, he said, echoing his mother's words. He didn't notice the letters arriving. Legal correspondence addressed to the estate was redirected by his assistant, skimmed and discarded as administrative noise. Names of law firms that should have raised alarms passed unnoticed. Michael was too busy enjoying the narrative he'd constructed. Victor, not villain. Patricia, through small gatherings, testing the waters of public opinion. Women came, curious, eager to see the new arrangement. Jennifer played her role perfectly, gracious, glowing, visibly pregnant. Patricia introduced her proudly, calling her the daughter I always wanted. They laughed together, drank champagne, and spoke openly about future renovations. The mansion became a stage for celebration. Grace, meanwhile, lived quietly. She woke early in her hotel room, prayed, and drank tea by the window. She read her grandmother's letter often, finding comfort in the steady handwriting. She met Rebecca Williams once a week, reviewing final documents, confirming timelines, preparing for what was coming next. Grace did not rush. She let Jennifer's posts circulate. Let Patricia's redesigns progress. Let Michael grow more careless. The louder they celebrated, the more visible their arrogance became. And arrogance, Grace knew, left fingerprints. Occasionally, she walked past the estate at a distance, just once, observing from across the street like a stranger. She saw delivery trucks come and go. New furniture arrive. Curtains removed. Windows thrown open to let in fresh energy. She felt no anger, only certainty. 2 weeks passed. By then, Patricia had planned something bigger, a grand garden party meant to formally introduce Jennifer to Lagos society. Invitations were sent, tents ordered, caterers booked. The mansion buzzed with anticipation. Jennifer posted another video, standing in front of the house, one hand on her belly, smiling confidently into the camera. New chapter, she wrote. God never fails. Grace watched the video once. Then she closed the app. Because while they were busy announcing their victory, Grace was still holding the truth they didn't know existed. And truth, unlike celebration, does not make noise. It waits, quietly, until the moment it decides to arrive. By the time Patricia decided to host the garden party, the story had already been rewritten in her mind. This was no longer about celebration alone. It was about presentation, about control, about announcing, to anyone who mattered, that the Thompson family had corrected a mistake and moved forward with dignity intact. Invitations went out weeks in advance, printed on imported cardstock, so thick it felt ceremonial. Across the top, in elegant gold lettering, were the words, "A celebration of new beginnings and true family." Patricia personally approved the guest list: governors' wives, CEOs, society matrons, fashion influencers, women whose opinions could shift reputations without ever raising their voices. This was the audience she wanted. This was the jury she intended to impress. The estate transformed in preparation. White tents were raised across the lawn, their fabric stretched tight and pristine. Crystal chandeliers were suspended from temporary frames, glittering even in daylight. Champagne arrived in crates, chilled and stacked with precision. Caterers who had served diplomats and dignitaries moved through the grounds with quiet efficiency, setting tables with linen so crisp it caught the light. Every detail was curated to scream prosperity, stability, triumph. Jennifer watched it all with barely contained excitement. She made several trips to Victoria Island in search of the perfect dress, finally settling on a designer maternity piece that hugged her body just enough to announce pregnancy without compromising elegance. In the mirror, she practiced her smile, warm but composed, humble but victorious. The smile of a woman who believed she had stepped seamlessly into a life meant for her. Patricia hovered nearby, offering approval and instruction in equal measure. "Stand tall," she said more than once. "You represent this family now." Michael prepared differently. On the morning of the party, he dressed slowly, choosing a senator-style agbada in a deep, commanding color. He admired himself in the mirror longer than usual, adjusting his cap just so. This was the image he wanted the world to see: a man who had made a difficult decision and emerged stronger for it. A man unburdened by mistakes. A man in control. By midday, the estate was alive with movement. Staff scurried across the lawn, adjusting chairs, polishing glassware, coordinating last-minute details. The band arrived early, testing equipment, letting soft music drift through the air like a promise. The garden smelled of flowers, perfume, and anticipation. At exactly 3 o'clock, the first guests began to arrive. Luxury cars lined the driveway, engines purring as drivers stepped out to open doors. Women in elaborate gelly and Swiss lace glided onto the lawn, air-kissing acquaintances, scanning the space with practiced eyes. Men followed, confident and reserved, already assessing the spectacle. Conversations flowed easily at first: business, politics, fashion, but beneath it all ran curiosity. People whispered questions into champagne glasses. Some remembered Grace. Some had liked her. Others had judged her quietly. Everyone wanted to see what had replaced her. Patricia positioned herself at the center of the garden, radiant in a coral gelly that took hours to tie. She received compliments with ease, her smile fixed and triumphant. Jennifer stood beside Michael, one hand resting on her belly, the other looped through his arm. Together, they looked every bit like the picture Patricia wanted displayed. As the garden filled, judgment moved silently between guests. Eyes flicked to Jennifer, then to the house behind her. Whispers followed. Some nodded approvingly. Others masked discomfort with polite smiles. This was Lagos society. No one spoke out loud, but everyone took notes. Michael felt the attention like warmth. He laughed loudly, told stories, basked in the praise of men who clapped him on the back and congratulated him on the baby. He wrapped his arm around Jennifer's waist protectively, occasionally squeezing as if to reassure himself and the crowd that this was the right choice. Jennifer played her role flawlessly. She accepted congratulations with grace, thanked people for their kindness, listened attentively when elders spoke. She spoke of family, of faith, of blessings. She made sure to smile at the right moments, to tilt her head just so, to project humility without diminishing victory. Patricia watched with satisfaction. This was what she had envisioned. This was how a proper Thompson woman should be received. As the afternoon wore on, the band picked up tempo. Plates of food circulated. Laughter grew louder. Glasses clinked. The estate buzzed with the confidence of people who believed they had secured their place. No one noticed the absence. Grace's name was not mentioned. Her presence not missed. Her silence interpreted exactly as Patricia hoped it would be: defeat. By 3:30, the party was in full swing. 300 guests stood beneath white tents, sipping champagne, judging quietly, waiting for the moment Patricia would formally present Jennifer as the new center of the Thompson family. This was meant to be the final seal, the public confirmation, the end of one story and the beginning of another. Patricia raised her glass slightly, preparing to speak. She did not know that the truth had already arrived at the gate, and it was done waiting. The band stopped mid-song as if the air itself had been sliced clean in two. At first, no one understood why. Conversations trailed off half-finished. Laughter faded unevenly. Then heads began to turn one by one toward the long driveway that led to the iron gates. A black Mercedes Maybach rolled in slowly. Not rushed. Not announced. It moved with the quiet confidence of something that didn't need permission, its polished body reflecting the afternoon sun as if the road itself belonged to it. The tires whispered against the driveway stones, each rotation deliberate, unbothered by the 300 guests now frozen in place. The car stopped. Silence spread across the garden like a held breath. The back door opened. Grace stepped out. And in that single moment, the atmosphere shifted so completely it felt physical, like pressure changing before a storm. This was not the woman who had been dragged out of the gates weeks earlier. This was not the quiet wife people had dismissed, pitted, or forgotten. Grace wore a navy Diola Sago suit tailored to perfection, structured and elegant, the fabric catching light without shouting for attention. Her hair was pulled into a low bun, woven with coral beads that framed her face with cultural authority. Diamond earrings flashed briefly as she straightened, their sparkle understated, but undeniable. Her makeup was flawless, not dramatic, intentional. The face of a woman who knew exactly who she was.
Her posture did the rest.
Grace stood tall, shoulders relaxed, chin lifted just enough to signal presence without arrogance. There was no anger in her eyes.
No lo esperaste.
No trace of the humiliation they expected her to carry back with her. Behind her stepped 4 men in tailored suits, their movements synchronized and calm. Senior advocates of Nigeria, briefcases in hand, expressions neutral but firm. Flanking them were 2 private security officers, alert without being aggressive, scanning the space with practiced precision. The garden was completely still. Champagne glasses hovered midair. Plates paused halfway to mouths. Phones rose instinctively, hands trembling slightly as people scrambled to record what their instincts told them would become history. Patricia was the first to find her voice. Her face twisted from shock to fury in seconds, disbelief snapping into rage. "Security!" she screamed, her voice sharp and shrill. "Remove that woman from my property immediately. How dare she show her face here?" A few heads turned back toward Grace, expecting her to shrink, to hesitate, to retreat under the weight of public rejection. She didn't. Grace closed the car door herself, slow and unhurried, then began to walk forward. Her heels clicked softly against the stone path, each step steady, measured, intentional. The lawyers followed. Security moved in formation beside her. She did not look at the guests. She did not look at Jennifer. She did not even look at Patricia. When Grace finally stopped, she was standing only a few feet away from where Patricia trembled with outrage, clutching her champagne glass so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Grace's voice, when she spoke, was calm, almost gentle. "Your property?" she asked. The question hung in the air. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It cut through the garden with surgical precision, sharper than the slap Patricia had delivered weeks earlier, heavier than every insult ever thrown at her. Patricia opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. One of the senior advocates stepped forward before she could recover, his presence commanding without theatrics. He adjusted his glasses, opened his briefcase, and addressed the crowd with professional clarity. "This estate," he said evenly, "including the mansion, the grounds you are currently standing on, and 17 additional properties across Lagos, Abuja, and Port Harcourt, has been legally transferred to Mrs. Grace Thompson as sole heir and owner." A ripple passed through the crowd. People gasped openly now. Murmurs broke free. Phones shook as grips tightened. The lawyer continued, unbothered by the reaction. "The valuation of the Thompson estate stands at approximately $700 million. The inheritance has been verified, probated, and certified. Mrs. Thompson's ownership is absolute." Michael pushed forward instinctively, his face pale, his confidence evaporating in real time. "That's impossible," he said, his voice rising, cracking. "I earned this. I worked for this house."
He stopped.
Because even as he spoke, something settled into place behind his eyes. The missing paperwork. The agreements he'd never signed. The title deeds he'd never seen. Another lawyer stepped forward calmly, holding out a second document. "Mr. Thompson," he said, "you occupied this property under a management arrangement linked to your employer. That lease was dissolved 3 months ago upon finalization of Mrs. Thompson's inheritance. You have been residing here without legal authorization." The word squatting wasn't spoken.
It didn't need to be.
Jennifer's smile had vanished completely now. Her face drained of color as she clutched Michael's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. "Michael," she whispered sharply, panic cutting through her voice.
What is she talking about?
"You said this was yours." Michael couldn't answer. Grace finally looked at him then. Not with hatred. Not with triumph. With clarity. "My grandmother," Grace said calmly, Elizabeth Thompson, was the firstborn daughter of the original Thompson family. She walked away from this fortune decades ago to marry a man who had nothing but integrity. When she died without renouncing her inheritance, it passed to me." She turned slowly, her gaze settling on Jennifer, whose confidence had collapsed into fear. "Every room you redecorated," Grace said quietly. "Every photo you posted, every moment you celebrated, it all happened in my house." Then Grace looked at Patricia. "You slapped me on my own front steps," she said. "You threw me out of my own estate. You called me a village girl while living off my bloodline." Patricia's hands shook violently now. The head lawyer cleared his throat. "Mrs. Thompson is exercising her legal right as property owner. All current occupants will be issued eviction notices effective immediately. 72 hours to vacate. Only personal belongings may be removed." A collective gasp tore through the garden. Grace turned slightly, her voice carrying clearly. "I apologize for interrupting your celebration," she said evenly. "But the party is over." Then she turned and walked back toward the Maybach. And behind her, the truth began to destroy everything it touched. The document trembled in Patricia's hands as if it carried weight beyond paper and ink. Her fingers, once so commanding, could barely keep hold of it now. The SAN's voice remained steady, professional, almost gentle, an unbearable contrast to the devastation unfolding in real time. "This deed confirms ownership of the Thompson estate," he said. "The Ikoyi mansion, the grounds you are standing on, and 17 additional properties across Lagos, Abuja, and Port Harcourt. The valuation stands at $700 million. Ownership rests solely with Mrs. Grace Thompson, by bloodline and by law." The garden did not breathe. 300 people stood locked in place, as if sound itself had been switched off. The band members stared at their instruments. Waiters froze with trays tilted at careful angles. Phones kept recording, but hands shook now, no longer excited, just stunned. Michael stepped forward, his voice breaking through the silence in sharp disbelief. "No," he said. "That's not possible. This house, my company." He stopped mid-sentence. The realization hit him slowly, cruelly. He had never signed a purchase agreement, never seen a title deed, never paid a transfer fee. Everything he thought he owned had been arranged, leased, managed for someone else. For her. The arrogance drained from his face, leaving something smaller, frightened. He looked at the mansion behind him, at the garden full of witnesses, at the woman he had discarded like trash, and for the first time, he understood the scale of his mistake. Jennifer clutched his arm, her nails biting into his sleeve. "Michael," she whispered urgently, her voice shaking. "You told me this was yours. You promised me this life." Michael did not answer. Grace watched them quietly. She felt no surge of triumph, no hunger for revenge, just a calm certainty settling into place, the way the ocean stills after a storm passes. Everything she had endured, the silence, the humiliation, the waiting, had led to this exact moment. The lawyer stepped forward again, this time holding a stack of documents. "These are eviction notices," he announced clearly. "Issued to Mr. Michael Thompson, Mrs. Patricia Thompson, and Ms. Jennifer Mitchell. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises." A gasp tore through the crowd. "You may remove personal items you brought with you," the lawyer continued. "All furniture, renovations, fixtures, and decorations installed without the owner's written consent remain property of the estate. Security will supervise the process." Jennifer's breath came in shallow bursts now. "This is insane," she said, her voice cracking. "Michael, say something." Patricia tried to speak, but the words collapsed in her throat. She looked from the document to Grace, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for authority that no longer existed. The woman who had once commanded rooms with a glance now stood shaking, exposed, powerless. Michael finally found his voice, but it was hollow. "Grace," he said, stepping closer, lowering his tone. "We can talk about this. There's been a misunderstanding." Grace raised her hand gently. "Not to silence him. To end him. This is not a conversation," she said calmly. "It's a conclusion." She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping across the garden, the faces that had come to witness her replacement, the whispers that had followed her silence, the phones that had once recorded her humiliation and now captured her restoration. "I apologize for interrupting your celebration," Grace said, her voice clear and composed. "But everyone needs to leave my property. The party is over." For a moment, no one moved. Then chairs scraped. Glasses clinked. Guests began to back away, murmuring urgently, dialing phones, already spreading the story. The energy shifted from curiosity to chaos. No one wanted to be associated with a fall this public. Jennifer broke first. She turned on Michael, her voice sharp with panic and fury. "You lied to me," she hissed. "You said you had everything under control. You said I was safe." Michael said nothing. Patricia sank into a nearby chair, the coral gully slipping slightly as she stared blankly ahead. The perfect party lay in ruins around her. Half-eaten plates, abandoned glasses, torn illusions. Grace turned and walked back toward the Maybach as her lawyers distributed the notices and her security team held the line. She did not look back. As the car door closed and the engine started, a quiet smile touched her lips, not from victory, but from relief. Her grandmother had been right. Power did not need to shout. It did not need to strike back in anger. It only needed the truth and time. Behind her, the estate emptied rapidly. Guests fled with stories. Alliances dissolved. Respect evaporated. The Thompson name, once spoken with pride, became a cautionary tale whispered behind hands. Grace leaned back against the seat as the car pulled away, the gates opening for her without resistance this time. The afternoon sun glinted off the mansion she had reclaimed. Not with bitterness, but with peace. The fall had been swift, and it had been earned. As the Maybach disappeared down the driveway and the iron gates closed behind Grace once more, this time in her favor, the truth was clear. The story did not end with the eviction. It only changed hands. Because reclaiming what was stolen is one thing. Deciding what to do with it is another. Michael, Patricia, and Jennifer had 72 hours to face the consequences of choices they never thought would catch up with them. Grace, meanwhile, had a future to reshape, on her own terms. Power had returned to its rightful place, but justice was only beginning to unfold. And what happens next will shock you even more than what you've just witnessed. Will Michael try to crawl back when he realizes everything is truly gone? What becomes of Jennifer when the new life she bragged about collapses overnight? And how will Grace use a $700 million empire, revenge, mercy, or something no one expects? Part 2 is coming very soon. If you want to see what happens next, don't scroll away without engaging. Like this video if you believe silence can be power. Subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of Grace's story. Turn on notifications, Part 2 drops soon. And tell me in the comments. If you were Grace, would you forgive? Or would you walk away forever? Do you think karma finished its work? Or is this just the beginning? Your answers matter. See you in Part 2.